Hey guys, this is Dave, and in this gigantic but pretty cool box is the Fiio Ft7. And I think they came out with the Ft5, about a year ago? And I did get a chance to listen to it, but it was very brief, and my time with it I didn't feel like it was significant enough for me to really make any kind of real assessment other than to say, I can say I didn't walk away from the Ft5 feeling like I made any real kind of connection with it, or I should say probably any connection with the music. But I have to say my experience with the Ft7 has been quite different, and I found myself making that connection pretty quickly with the Ft7, and that doesn't always happen. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but I can certainly say that I feel like they got a lot right with this one. In any case, as usual, we'll go ahead and go over the contents of the box. We'll talk about the specifications, the design, and then we'll get into sound. So this is everything that comes in the box. You got this nice hard case, you got the headphones, 2 pad options, you've got the lambskin pads, and then you also have a fabric pad. You get this cable, which this is a 4.4 cable, but it also comes with some adapters. You got an XLR adapter and a 6.35 adapter. All right, so as far as the build quality and the design of the Ft7, to the touch, this feels really, really nice as far as the materials that they used and the different finishes. It just feels really robust, it feels well constructed, and it's also quite stunning to look at. And you can see they've used a combination of carbon fiber, and then you've got zebra wood here for the ear cups. So it certainly does have a little more of kind of a premium look and feel to it. And as far as the fit and comfort, it's lightweight. I think it weighs around 430 grams without the cable, and it has a pretty decent amount of width and depth to the ear cups as well. So I think it should accommodate most ears just fine. Although if I had one minor nitpick, it would be that the adjustment sliders here do have a tendency to kind of move out of place. If I pull down even just a little too much when I'm putting them on my head, they'll slide. So of course that means I'm finding myself occasionally having to kind of readjust those. Not a huge deal really, but just something to take note of. But otherwise, overall, the fit and comfort has been quite good for me. And I wouldn't necessarily call this a small headphone. However, considering this uses a 106 millimeter planar magnetic driver, it's not really as big as you might expect it to be. So I think they did a pretty good job keeping the overall weight and size to a minimum, again, considering the size of the driver. And then speaking of the driver, of course, this has an open back design. And again, we're talking about a pretty large driver here. And based on the description on the website, they've applied different layers of 24 karat gold and pure silver to the driver coil. And as far as the drivability, it has an impedance of 25 ohms and a sensitivity of 94 dBs. So you should be able to drive it decently with a pretty wide range of sources. And I will talk more about that in the sound segment. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and move on to sound. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk about drivability first. So as I had mentioned, this doesn't require much in terms of power. As a matter of fact, I was able to reach listenable volume levels even with my Questyle M18i, my M15i. So out of the 4.4 balanced output, I was able to achieve pretty loud volume levels in high gain, again, with the M18i, between about 30 to 34 volume steps out of 60. And then that was the same basically with my DAPs. My DX340 had no problem driving this and driving it very beautifully, I might add. And it also paired nicely with the DX260 MK2, my Hibi Pro Max, the Onyx XM10. So all of those worked really, really well with this. And then of course, I also tested this with some of my more powerful desktop devices like the Fiio K19, K9 Pro ESS, the DNA Alpha Pro here, and then I also have the Matrix Audio Element M2, and then my X Duo TA32 over on the other side of my desk over here. And actually, two of my favorite pairings with the FT7 were this K19, which is basically my neutral reference, and then the TA32. I think I like the TA32 a little better, and of course, that's a Class A hybrid DAC tube amp combo. And of course, those are going to give you two very different listening experiences, but both really equally enjoyable with the FT7. Of course, with the K19, I felt like that was giving the FT7 a less colored signal, and that really allowed me to kind of assess the FT7's actual sound signature and also give it its best chance at maximizing its technical or detail capabilities. And then with the TA32, while not necessarily, of course, maximizing or highlighting the FT7's technical capabilities, it kind of went the other direction, and it gave me a warmer, I guess, more organic, more rich presentation, and it just had more weight, and it was just generally, I guess, a more lush sounding presentation. And it also seemed to help tame some of the upper treble presence a little bit as well. And I'll explain why in a minute, but let's go ahead and talk about its presentation, then we'll circle back to that pairing in just a minute. Now, as far as the sound presentation of the FT7, I would call this neutral, but I'm also picking up on some brightness up top. So I guess neutral bright might be a more accurate description depending on which pads you use. So let's talk about the pads really quickly. So I prefer these fabric pads over the lambskin pads. And of course, this will come down to your preference, but what's happening is that brightness in the treble seems to be a little more pronounced with the lambskin pads. So if that's something that you're potentially going to be sensitive to, then these fabric pads might help with that, because again, they just seem to tame that brightness a little bit. Not completely, but it does help quite a bit, at least for me. And I guess I should clarify that the brightness, even with the lambskin pads, really isn't that bad. And the reason I prefer the fabric pads over the lambskin pads, it has more to do with tonality and its overall cohesiveness, and not necessarily because the lambskin pads cause it to be overly bright, because it doesn't really ever reach the point of becoming fatiguing. It just simply sounds more natural to me with these fabric pads. But going back to the TA32, so when I paired this with the TA32, that's going to help further reduce a little bit of that sharpness going on in the treble. And again, while you're not necessarily going to be able to experience all the technical capabilities the FT7 has to offer with the TA32, it was still very, very enjoyable. Again, it had a slightly richer tonality, and it really brought a bit of a lushness to its presentation. And I just felt like the TA32 complemented the FT7 very, very well. And then again, going back to the K19 pairing, of course, that is actually what I would consider to have a more uncolored, even what some might consider to be a kind of clinical presentation. So that pairing was very different in that it basically let all of those treble colorations shine through, and it allowed the FT7 to retain its sound signature. But at the same time, it also allowed me to experience the impressive technical capabilities of the FT7. Now, other good treble qualities are it has good treble extension and a nice airiness to its presentation, maybe even what some might call overly airy, which isn't really a problem necessarily. It's just not what I'm used to. Now, another characteristic I picked up on in the treble is it did sound a little fragile to me. And I didn't hear it all the time. It was really recording dependent. So I heard it with some recordings and not others. And I guess this would fall under the category of things I didn't like about the treble. And again, the only way I can think to describe it is that it had a little bit of a fragile or brittle sound presentation. And if I'm being completely honest, it could at times even become a little distracting. So that's definitely one thing about this set. Again, I wish they would have approached it maybe a little differently. But as we progress through the rest of the review, you will no doubt start to get the sense that the Ft7 does get a lot right. But again, unfortunately, that's just not one of those things. Now, in regards to the rest of its presentation, and I know I'm working my way backwards here, but we'll just go ahead and move to the mids and then we'll do bass last. But for the most part, I would say the mid-range is done very, very well as far as it not having anything in its presentation that sounds incorrect or unnatural. And while I would say vocals can have a tendency to sound maybe a little pushed back or a little further away than what I'm used to, I don't get the sense that they're pushed back too far. They're still close enough or forward enough and energetic enough to keep my focus. So songs like Come Away With Me by Norah Jones still have that intimate presentation so that I feel like I'm experiencing, again, that closeness or that intimacy of her vocals in that recording. So again, the mid-range simply sounds correct and natural. And then as you move into the bass, again, while I would consider the Ft7's overall presentation to fall, or the bass presentation to fall within the neutral range, it doesn't strike me as sounding overly thin or lacking in any way. And while I would say, depending on the recording, I did at times feel my attention being pulled the opposite direction towards that brightness in the treble, I did still feel like there was enough bass energy to help keep that treble energy in check for the most part. But I think the thing that stood out to me the most about its bass presentation was just the sheer quality and refinement of the bass. So the bass texture, the bass separation, the control, it just had a really nice, again, kind of a refined presentation to it. And for this being an open back set, I have to say I'm finding very little to complain about in terms of its overall bass quality. Not to mention, the bass extension is simply excellent. So when I step back and look at its bass presentation on the whole, there really isn't much missing. I feel like I'm getting the whole bass picture, or the complete bass picture. Bottom line though is I think they did a spectacular job with the bass presentation with the Ft7. Now, another area the Ft7 stands out among the competition is in its technical performance. More specifically, its detail and resolution. It's simply, I mean, it's among the best I've heard at this price point. And of all of the other full-size sets that I own currently, or that I've heard in the past around this price point, like the 99 Classics, the 105 AER, the Baroque here, the Moondrop Cosmo, and even more expensive sets like my HD800S, my Aria Stealths, and even my LCD3s. It wasn't until I started comparing the Ft7 with those that I was able to even really find the limitations as far as the technical limitations of the Ft7. That's how resolving the Ft7 is, which is really something, again, considering its price. Now, as far as its soundstage, I wouldn't say it's super wide or stand out necessarily, although I would say it's still competitive within this price range. That said though, its instrument separation, its layering, and just the clarity of the image, the focus and the density of the image is really, really good. Even standout, I would say, for this price point. So on a technical level, this is, again, not just competitive for its price point, but I think this actually is probably one of the more technical sets that I've heard under $1,000. Now, as far as comparisons, of course, I have the new Baroque here by Harmonic Dyne. This is priced at $560, so it is a little less expensive. And this also has a more of a neutral tuning, but it is a little warmer in its presentation overall, and maybe a little more relaxed in the upper mids and treble as well. So it's not going to have the same brightness or treble energy up top. Now, the FT7 is certainly going to outclass it in terms of detail levels, but that's not to say the Baroque doesn't have its strengths as well. But keep an eye out for a full review on the Baroque. I'm going to stop there as far as doing a comparison with the Baroque for now. But compared with something like the $799 Meze 109 Pro, I would have to also give it to the FT7 in terms of technical performance, and probably even in terms of its overall tuning as well. Although the 109 Pro does bring maybe an added sense of weight and some additional mid bass as well. But one characteristic that the 109 Pro does share with the FT7 is it also has some of that energy or brightness up top. Although I do think the FT7 does do a better job at controlling that brightness. And then when you add the fabric pads, that can help tame it even further. But at the end of the day, I think I do prefer the FT7 overall compared with the 109 Pro. And then compared with something maybe a little more expensive, unless you buy it used, and it's also a little older, like the Aria Stealth. The Aria Stealth also has a little bit of that sharpness or that edge up top, but the FT7, again, does a better job of taming that edge than the Aria Stealth. And I even feel like the FT7 sounds a little more, not natural necessarily, they both have issues in that department, but maybe a little more balanced or proportioned and definitely more cohesive than the Aria Stealth, at least to my ears. And it also seems to have a little more of a punchy or more of a dynamic presentation as well. But yeah, I love the Stealth, but I think I would have to give it to the FT7 as far as it coming maybe a little closer to my preferences. So I guess at the end of the day, the FT7 is unquestionably my favorite full-size headphone release by Fiio to date. And it's not only competitive for its price point, but I would say in many ways, it can throw blows with some of the best headphones that I've heard under $1,000. So I have to give it to Fiio on this one. And it certainly gets my recommendation, especially if you are looking to purchase a headphone within this price range. You just need to be aware of that extra energy, and again, it does have a little bit of that unevenness, I guess, up top. So something to consider if you think that might be a deal breaker for you, but it certainly wasn't for me. But again, at the end of the day, I think the FT7 is a spectacular headphone, and again, it does absolutely get my recommendation. But anyways, I think that does it for this video. If you are new to the Gazaudio channel and you like our videos, please take a minute and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to go a step further, you can also support us through our Patreon. I'll be sure and leave a link in the description. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this review. Please like this video, please comment on this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.